Welcome to the first session of Lethe, Impressions of Forgetfulness and Concealment by Franziska, Aigner and Austin Gross. This seminar will embark on a philosophical trajectory to four discourses that have taken forgetting as a theme in transcendental context. First sight, philosophical modernity, and in particular the Enlightenment period, can and perhaps should be read as, above all, a renewed reflection on the meaning and the role of forgetting. While ever since ancient Greece, every possible object of thought could be given a place in mental spheres of ars memoria, only forgetting could not. The Enlightenment period would go on to elevate forgetting to a faculty in its own right. This can nowhere be seen better than in the writings of Kant, who not only instituted forgetting as a faculty, but furthermore elevated forgetting to a condition of possibility for autonomous thought and judgment. Second sight, by insisting on its technical and external prosthesis, Stiegler opened a way of historicizing memory beyond philosophical anthropology. But mnemotechnics are also Lethe techniques, and vice versa. It is, however, the thought of forgetting and its relation to techniques which Stiegler finds the figure of Epimetheus, which even in works of philosophy, seminal thinker of forgetting, Heidegger, has itself been forgotten. The excavation of relationship between techniques and forgetting is the leitmotif of Stiegler's project. Third sight, what's the word? The name Freud can't find is as expressive as a symptom. Lacan took this case as an example to give substance to the formula of metaphor and metonymy he had enunciated in the instance of the letter. With his rubble logic on one hand, we'll follow him through Freud's text freely into other applications. We will then return to Memory Palace, considering little Hans' phobic schematism and the edifice of Derelium. Fourth sight, to leave something, let's say a mark, doesn't always mean taking a secure deposit. A trace might be something left behind, let go of, to leave, if is ambivalently a figure of memory in its positivity, and of forgetting in its destitution, like Eros, child of Poros and Penia. But we'll pivot from Lacan's literature to Hegel's dialectic, in which forgetting and self-forgetting play a crucial role. Franziska, Aigner, and Austin Gross are the instructors of the seminar. Franziska Aigner works at the intersection of philosophy, performance, and music. In 2020, she completed a PhD at the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy, London, on the topic of Kant and Technics. Complementing her philosophical work, she has studied at PARTS, the School of Choreography and Dance in Brussels, directed by Anne-Theresa de Keersmaker, and worked with Anne Imhoff on performances Deal, Rage, Angst, and Faust, which was awarded the Golden Lion at Venice Biennale 2017. Her own works have been shown at Castelin Festival Deserts, Brussels, The Place, London, Brut, Vienna, HAU, Berlin. In 2019, the music for Faust was released on Berlin label PAN. Furthermore, Franziska Aigner is part of Holy Herden Vocal Ensemble, with whom she tours internationally. She performs her own solo project with cello and vocals under the name Frankie. Her first solo EP was released with Icelandic label Bedroom Community in the fall of 2021. In 2021, Franziska also collaborated for the sound art piece The Close World, which won the John Fries Award. Austin Gross is the PhD candidate at the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy, London. His research concentrates on return to authority in philosophy and on philosophers who claim to rely on tradition in a philosophical manner, particularly on how, rather than turning back on scholasticism, these philosophers borrowed from jurisprudence and theology to articulate their position. He has also written on Lacan, Sade, and contemporary theater poetics. I'm now going to pass the mic to the instructors. Franziska and Austin, the mic is yours.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm so happy that you've decided to join Austin and me in this seminar that we have dreamt up together, and that has come out of a kind of like long process of talking about some of these themes because they also appear in our work. Not on a continuous conversation between us, but anyways, conversation on themes related to forgetting over a long period of time for many different reasons. And yeah, so I don't know, Austin, do you quickly want to say something before I go on?
Well, I was thinking I would say something after you give your start.
Okay. Yeah. So we just so that you understand a little bit. So basically, we have split the seminar in two. So I'm going to speak today and the second seminar, and then Austin is going to give the third and the fourth seminar. And because this first seminar, so today's seminar, we were told is going to be made public. We were somehow invited to do the obligatory introduction round at the end of the seminar. So just in case that might, you might notice that. I mean, yeah, so we're going to do that hopefully at the end of the seminar where we'll get to know each other a little bit. And for now, I'm just going to basically jump straight into the first seminar. And this first seminar has 3 parts. So I will start with a very general introduction that also Austin will then contribute a little bit to give sort of like a anticipation or to allow us to anticipate at least the outlines of the overall trajectory that we're going to be reading together, speaking together, thinking together. And after this sort of like general introduction, I have prepared 2 parts for us today. So I will first give a rather brief and schematic introduction to Simonides, the ancient Greek poet who is well known for having been the one to have invented the art of memory, and the Greek politician and military general Themistocles, who is supposedly charged with having first given birth, we can say, to the art of forgetting, a rather ominous art. And then in the second part, which is somehow like the, I would say, main part, hopefully we will have enough time of today's seminar, which is going to deal with Kant, but in a rather unusual manner. I don't know if any of you have taken any of my other seminars of Kant over the past years at the New Center, but I work a lot on the very late Kant, and this Kant is maybe unusual to many people who mainly read his writing from the critical period or even from the pre-critical period, because it stands in close proximity, is sort of like threatened in its integrity by Kant's supposed senility. So this is some sort of going to be the second part of the seminar. All right, so I'm going to jump into the first part, which is the general introduction. Let me just pull it up. All right. So, the main theme, we could say, of the seminar is forgetting, right? We know that much. And this phenomenon, which we call forgetting, is part of our everyday psychic lives, both individually and collectively speaking. And in fact, it is so general an experience, so all-pervasive, that we're told, for instance, by a cultural historian Harald Weinrich in his book Lethe, The Art and Critique of Forgetting, which I've put as an additional reading for today's course, so it's so general an experience that the phenomenology of forgetting itself is in no need of an explanation. We all know what it means and what it feels like to forget. The supposed counterpart of this so common process of forgetting is, of course, remembering. But differently to forgetting, remembering is generally considered an achievement. And so it's fundamentally different from the idea of forgetting being this common misfortune, right? Something that befalls us, that befalls even the best of us. We live with the consensus. Aleida Assmann, who I also read rather extensively for this first seminar together, she puts it like this: we live with this consensus that we need to remember and that we must fight forgetting. That is sort of like, you know, how we think this coupled together. It was until fairly recently that the history of Western thought pitted remembering and forgetting against each other as these kind of counterparts, right? So they're as like antipodes or even enemies to one another, with remembering being valued and aligned with positive notions such as consciousness, light, the good, but the unfortunately very difficult to achieve, while forgetting is devalued as the problematic, unconscious, unintentional counterpart that befalls us, this misfortune which takes place quietly in the shadows of everyday life, as a necessity on the one hand, but on the other hand, also as something that is to be avoided and resisted. At the same time, and in particular within like Christian or secular Christian cultures and traditions of thought, forgetting is also thought in alignment with mercy, amnesty, and the grace of resolve, particularly when it comes to old age. And this is an idea that within memory studies, etc., is often brought up, picked up. So the current of forgetting, the kind of flow of forgetting that eventually pulls all of history, be it our personal history or the history of like a nation or a civilization. So the current of history that eventually pulls all of history into itself is here read through in this line of thought that's is aligned with Christianity, is read through the lens and appreciated as the work of the grace of a God who may pardon us and free us from our sins, right? He might forgive us and forget our sins. However, within the setting of the 20th century, we also know that the 20th century was witness to a burden of history so heavy and so big, so singular in its horrific crimes, that it has decisively put this idea of the resolve, the mercy of forgetting into question. There is, as the 20th century has shown, a critical threshold of what forgetting can achieve, of what it can afford. So there's a critical threshold to the historical burden that may be handed over to forgetting. If genocide or crimes against humanity and violation of basic human rights stand between the present and the past, so between ourselves and this past, there is an ethical duty to remember this past and therefore resist, right? That's what it is about, to resist the sweet resolve administered by forgetting for the sake of a different future, for the sake of this famous phrase, never again. And at the heart of this argument lies the idea that so once the burden of history has crossed this threshold, a decision is needed. And that means that as humans, both as a social group, but also as individual human beings, we can, in fact, and we must choose between remembering and forgetting. And this decision is ethical at its heart. And this is, of course, the universal teaching of the horrors of what Adorno referred to under the name of Auschwitz, which is also referred to as the Holocaust, which we speak to under the name of the Holocaust. So the ethical duty to resist this pull of forgetting when it comes, for instance, to the horrific crimes committed during National Socialism has in German present-day culture given rise to the infamous Erinnerungskultur, so memory culture, in service of this nie wieder, never again. And anyone who, I assume we we're all familiar with current international politics. Of course, this idea and practice of memory culture has been much discussed in the recent months regarding its capacities to prevent such a never again, particularly in light of Germany's reaction, which is where I'm currently based, to the most recent events of October 7th. And while at the same time, you know, Germany's right-wing party with explicit fascist thought and ambitions has become the second strongest party across several German regions and is anticipated to do very well in the upcoming elections. So the context, so the political, ethical, but also the epistemological context of our inquiry into forgetting is already beginning to take shape, right? We just have to sort of like look at the broad outlines. And there's a lot to consider. But I would like us to sort of take a step back and as one does often in philosophical inquiries, spend a little bit of time at the outside remembering ancient Greece, I guess. So Greek mythology knew of a goddess of forgetting, and this goddess was called Lethe. Her counterpart was Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. And while Mnemosyne is aligned with light, Lethe is said to descend from the lineage of the night. And while the goddess of memory is the famous mother of the muses, shedding light on the essential role that memory plays for the arts, for poetry, for music, the mother of Lethe is none other than Eris, discord. And we will encounter Eris, the mother of forgetting, in our next seminar quite prominently, when I will introduce some of the ideas that one can find in Bernard Stiegler's approach to philosophy of technology, and particularly his reading of the myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus. Because according to the myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus, the gift of technicity, which was bestowed upon man by Prometheus in order to make up for the fault of his brother Epimetheus. So Epimetheus forgot when he handed out characteristics to all beings, he forgot about the human. And then in order to make up for this fault, Prometheus gave the human fire and technicity. So the gift of technicity gives rise to Eris, discord. And discord, Bernard Stiegler suggests in his reading of this myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus, is thus the political effect of prostasticity, we could say, because at its heart, the gift of prostasticity carries an ambiguity. It's a pharmacon, and as such, it both saves and condemns us at the same time. But we will speak more about Eris and technicity in the next seminar. For now, all we know is that the mother of forgetting is Eris, right? But the myth of the goddess of Lethe is complemented in Greek mythology with another side. And the second side within ancient Greek mythology tells us that Lethe is also, and perhaps most importantly, one of the 5 rivers of the underworld. And it was the role of the river Lethe to bestow forgetting upon the souls of the deceased. So to drink from the water of Lethe affected, this is what ancient Greek mythology tells us, the dissolving of the contours of memory. So the deceased soul is to drink from the waters of Lethe in order to dissolve their memory and allow, in a later step, to be reborn in a new body and according to a new form. And so we can see here a source, like a real wealth of metaphors that align sort of like forgetting with fluidity and water, more generally deriving from this ancient Greek site of forgetting. A third site of forgetting that we can find in ancient Greek thought is in the later classical Greek notion of aletheia, so the ancient Greek notion of truth. And in his Vom Wesen der Wahrheit, on the essence of truth, which is Martin Heidegger's inquiry into the essence of truth, Heidegger proposes to return, as it were, from the notion of truth as adequation and quidditas that we find at work from approximately Aristotle until modernity, to the earlier pre-Socratic notion of aletheia. That is the sort of like proposal of the book, right? The term aletheia is composed of two parts. So we have a, which is a negative prefix, and then we have letheia, with the word root lethe, which of course stands for forgetting, oblivion, and concealment. And we might all know that famously Heidegger read aletheia therefore as unconcealment. In German, the word for it is Unverborgenheit. And he arrived at this reading by way of the etymology of the term on the one hand, and by way of the understanding given to it by the pre-Socratics, who, he argues, experienced the character of being as unconcealment, and they called this aletheia. Importantly here is that this notion of truth, because of its negative prefix, so because of the a in front of it, is essentially privative. So truth is that which is freed from something, which is freed from concealment. It is what is no longer concealed. And so already in terms of its linguistic structure, it differentiates essentially from, the German term Wahrheit, or also the Latin veritas, etc. Aletheia is privative. True is that which has something no longer. And for Heidegger, that something is concealment, and so truth is read as unconcealment. We will speak about Heidegger, whose entire project, we could say, wants to remember, as it were, the forgetting of being, Seinsvergessenheit, and the forgotten of philosophy in our second seminar, so in our the next seminar, which is dedicated to philosophy of technology, and in particular Bernhard Stiegler, because Stiegler is a very lucid reader of Heidegger and a strong critic. Basically accuses Heidegger, we could say, of having forgotten about epimetheos, so the forgetful one, and reads the entire sort of like complex of techniques through this Heideggerian fault, who in his attempt of remembering has himself forgotten. Harald Weinrich reminds us that the word Lethe, that the word root Lethe in aletheia, however, can and perhaps should also be read in light of the other meanings of the term, so forgetting and oblivion, reminding us that the ancient Greek notion of truth might also have something to do with forgetting. And so he reads, because of the negative prefix, aletheia as the unforgotten, or the not to be forgotten, and thus ultimately as what is rescued from the all-pervasive arms or waters of Lethe, of forgetting, that which is remembered. And so for hundreds of years, Weinrich goes on to write, and I quote from his book, he writes, Western philosophical thought, following the Greeks, sought truth on the side of not forgetting, and thus of memory and remembrance. Only in modern times has it more or less hesitantly attempted to grant forgetting a certain truth as well. And I would say that the aim of this four-part seminar, despite its very short and compressed form, which doesn't really allow us to like trace certain movements for a very long time, but has this rather like staccato nature, we could say. The aim of this 4-part seminar is to read philosophy in terms of what it can tell us about forgetting, as well as what it can tell us about the meaning of forgetting and the role that forgetting plays and has always already played in and for philosophy. So there are a number of sites of forgetting within the canon of transcendental philosophy that Austin and myself have chosen. So there are 4 to be precise, and they're referred to under the name Themistocles, Epimetheus, Kant, Stiegler, Freud, Hegel, and Lacan. And some of these sites or some of these figures are themselves forgotten, have been forgotten. Some deal with the troublesome forgetfulness of one or another philosophical protagonist, and thus with the threat that forgetting poses to philosophy as a possible forgetting of philosophy. And some try to think and inquire into forgetting on the level of content, and thus as a essential philosophy or a thought on forgetting. And this first seminar, which we have just started together and which is sort of like prepared by myself, will focus on 2 of these sites, as I've already said. So I will, after these first introductory remarks, speak about Simonides and the origin myth of the ancient art of memory in contradistinction to Themistocles and the art of forgetting, before we will then make this massive jump to the Enlightenment and its relation to forgetting, in particular in the work and life of Immanuel Kant, who was one of those forgetful ones, but also referring to at least the outlines of his explicit thought of forgetting, which has, as far as I understand, not been paid very much attention. And in the second seminar, as I said, I'll then speak about Stiegler's concept of technics in its relation to forgetting, with a special focus on his forceful critique of Heidegger. And if I manage, there's always like the problem of time. I would like to juxtapose this Stieglerian critique of Heidegger, the 20th century thinker of forgetting, with Lyotard's critique of Heidegger. And the third and the fourth seminars will then be led by Austin. And so I will quickly hand over to Austin to introduce those.
Thank you. Thanks first for mentioning these political stakes. And I think that we both, since you invited me, we've both been thinking a lot about the reality of the topic. And for me, a lot of this is the experience and reality of migration. Later, you're going to present to us the founding myth of the memory palace, which is indeed a palace in ruins. Can you hear me all right? I didn't put the thing in front of me. You can all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. The memory palace is a palace in ruins before it's a Technics. But what kind of a Technics is a home that you've been forced to flee, or a neighborhood that's in rubble? What kind of a Technics does that give? What happens to, or another way to put it is that a home is famously something that you become familiar with. Sorry about that plus thing, it just does that. A home is something you become familiar with and forget. But homelessness, or losing your home, or your home being reduced to rubble, also imposes a condition of forgetting. And the question is what the structure of this is. So we're not going to necessarily answer that question, but we're going to take some antecedents on the philosophy of forgetting and try to get to a point where we're comfortable putting their they're concepts to use. The first of these is a poetic thinking of forgetting. It's in Psychoanalysis. It's Lacan's structuralist poetics from the late 50s. And you could also give this figure, I would give it the name Signorelli, from Freud's case of a forgotten name, the name of an Italian painter. Lacan, to sum it up in one formula, takes this forgetting as a unattained metaphor, a failure to produce a metaphor. And he is presenting it in terms of his formulae, borrowed, eventually from Jacobson's paper on aphasia, which is also in a way about forgetting. The second of my two sites, so the third session is on forgetting as a failed metaphor in Freud and Lacan. The fourth session is with Hegel. And it's also from language in a way, because we're going to start from the proposition, the way the proposition itself is forgetful. Both the representational proposition, which forgets its kind of dialectical origin and the place it's going, which is also a contradiction. It loses the fact that it comes from and it's going to a contradiction in many cases. It sees itself as just a given. And the other kind of proposition, which would be the speculative proposition, in which the subject goes under in the predicate. But we're going to take a specific example of this, which is the predicate experience, I experience, or I learned, in the introduction to the phenomenology of spirit. So we won't necessarily be talking that much about speculative propositions, but we're taking one. That's the way we're going to pose forgetting the next time in terms of this going under of the subject. We'll take it slowly because both of these authors are pretty difficult, and our main goal again will be to get comfortable enough putting these concepts to use. And on that, I'll give it back to Fran.
Yeah, well, yeah, really excited and very grateful to have the opportunity also, to do this together with Austin, because as you can tell, we come from very different like primary sources, we could say. And I feel it's also an opportunity for us to somehow put some of these things, pose them like to each other and hopefully put them to use. Particularly interested on some of the Kant, Hegel, but also Stiegler, Hegel conversations that can emerge on questions of memory and authority, I guess, because this is like a really primary concern for Kant and his critique of memory, but also the question of prostheticity and the externalization of memory, which is a major concern, of course, for Stiegler, and is just expressed with very much lucidity, of course, in Hegel already. So I have to say I've never at the New Center taught a course like that. Normally I always teach these seminars around like one author and one book, which is on some level really like impossibility, because for seminars it's never enough to even get close to reading the book together. On the other hand, the kind of unity of the courses is easier to give and anticipate, and easier to fathom for all the people that read it together with me. So yeah, I just hope that despite all these different sites and the kind of like open questions, and also like really like realpolitische stakes that we're all living, that we can find a way to speak to each other, and hopefully leave these 4 seminars with maybe some bricks in our hands. So before moving on to the first scene of forgetting, which is, of course, the reading of Simonides and Themistocles, there's another like preliminary remark, which I would like to quickly walk us through, because I think it goes to the very heart of our problem, and it will inform us in each of these other sides. And that is, of course, the methodological problem posed by forgetting to inquiry. Now, what is this problem? The problem is, of course, that forgetting withdraws, we could say, from both consciousness and attention. And it does so in very many different ways, because forgetting is the general name that we give to a whole host of different operations by which something disappears or exits the stage, or when it comes to, this ominous notion of primary repression by Freud, for instance, manages to avoid the stage altogether, to play on a certain Hegelian metaphor. In her book Formen des Vergessens, Forms of Forgetting, Aleida Assmann points to 9 different techniques. I mean, she will later speak about the 7 forms of forgetting, but actually I've decided to speak about the 9 different techniques of forgetting, which she points out, because these 9 different techniques are sort of like her attempts to work out the way in which forgetting is implemented in a variety of practical and symbolic acts. And each of these techniques of forgetting makes possible, but also impossible, a different mode of inquiry. And so in order to sharpen our minds a little bit around the question of method, of how to think about forgetting, I thought it would be good to quickly speak us through these 9 techniques to remind us of the multitude of phenomena, the multitude of like kind of operations which we refer to under the name of forgetting. And maybe they can be some useful tools, even though it kind of comes from this meta discourse once we start speaking about the different philosophical sides. So I'll try and not take too much time with that, but yeah, so here we go. So the first that she points out is deleting. That is the act by which a trace of something is erased. So the connection from the present to the past is irrevocably cut, we could say. And of course, what is erased can't be studied. But not every act of forgetting is that definitive or that final. So the second act that she points out is forgetting as concealment, which we have just encountered through this very brief discussion of aletheia. So covering up, concealing, is an act by which something is covered and pushed out of immediate communication. So it has lost its urgency or its force. It no longer troubles us. Assmann says, like, we might all know about it, but it has somehow receded into the background. And so there are ways of studying it. And, you can look at, for example, like how Heidegger reads in order to understand, well, if you think that forgetting is a problem of concealment, then let's look at his method, right? The third technique is what for Freud, in fact, what Freud considered to be the motor of forgetting as a whole, which is repression. And it denotes the attempt of getting rid of a sign or of a memory or of a trace, because for Freud, of course, we know it's connected to guilt or shame, etc. And we also know from Freud that is sort of like the gift that he has bequeathed to us, that repression results in its very opposite, namely its reinforcement within the psychic economy. And we will speak about repression and the challenges that it poses to remembering, including when it comes to this ominous mode of primary repression, Urverdrängung, in the next seminar, as well as the sort of like affordances that it has for inquiry and remembering, as well as the challenges. The fourth mode of forgetting that Assmann points out is what she calls silencing, which is the process by which either like a distressing event or a trace is sort of like, for her, like mainly banned from communication. So it's just something we don't speak about, while it is latently conserved, she points out. So there's a trace, it can be studied. There are certain challenges how to remember it. Most of them are psychological, we can say. The fifth mode of forgetting, overwriting, is the most general operation of forgetting, the most common for Assmann, which can relate to very many different materials and can be done both consciously and unconsciously. So there's an overriding, for example, the image of the ancient papyrus rolls is a good example of that. Or certain metaphors from the computer, I guess. The sixth mode of forgetting, sorry, just one last thought on overriding. Of course, then questions emerge around the kind of plasticity of this memory and that sort of like archaeology of the trace of the overriding, and that has its own methodological challenges, but also affordances. The sixth mode of forgetting is ignoring, which she calls, Assmann calls, the operation of banishing something from the scene of attention as a whole. So that's something else. It's not something that's banned from communication, but it's something that's banned from the scene of attention as a whole. And the seventh mode for her is neutralization, which is characterized, it works a bit different. It's an operation by which a trace is moved sort of like from the center of attention to the periphery. And so this sort of like neutralization is also an act by which a trace or a sign, a memory loses some of its urgency, or even in certain respects can lose some of its validity. Denying is the opposite of neutralization. And it's essentially a mode of forgetting which, in a quasi-ironic manner, conserves a trace through its negative prefix. And so her Assmann's example is really sort of like spot on here, because she exemplifies denial by way of Jean-Claude Pressac, the famous Holocaust denier, who, while he was seeking evidence in support of his claims of the denial of the Holocaust, ironically became the first to, in fact, scientifically study and confirm the systematic nature of the gas chambers and crematoriums used by National Socialism in its genocidal project of wiping out Jews, but also, of course, Roma, Sinti, political enemies, so-called asocial people, homosexuals, people with special needs, etc., during National Socialism. The ninth mode of forgetting referred to by Assmann is this primary experience that we are supposedly all so intimately familiar with, which is losing a trace. And this ninth mode of forgetting refers to this sort of like idea of this flow of forgetting, or also like a current or an undertow that is mentioned at the very beginning, which is at work in all of us, consciously and unconsciously. So whether we are aware of it or not, because there's this idea that natural anamnesic memory, our memory has sort of like a storage problem, and so in a sense it forgets more than it retains. So we can see that some techniques of forgetting escape our attention but leave latent traces, and so can be recovered. Some have only to do with being pushed out of communication, some, however, escape presentation and consciousness altogether, for example, when it comes to primary repression. And so how can forgetting be studied? Well, first of all, one would then imagine, we have to be quite specific by what we mean, because it's a general term for many different kinds of particular phenomena. But of course, the methodological challenge is great, since one must, in one way or another, be able to ask, problematize, or remember what is claimed in some cases to be structurally absent, or remember something which is no longer, or perhaps never has been represented altogether. And so every thinker intending to study and inquire into forgetting has to confront this question anew. And I'll deal with it particularly in our next seminar, because Bernard Stiegler himself, in fact, argues that, famously argues that Technics is the forgotten of philosophy, and critiques Heidegger, who speaks about remembering and Seinsvergessenheit, so the forgetting of being, etc. And each of these thinkers has to somehow confront this question, how it is possible, what the conditions of possibility for their own inquiry, for their own mode of remembering is. And even if they formulate their own methodological conditions of possibility, they might nevertheless at the same time forget, or in fact further conceal, something themselves. And Heidegger is, of course, here our prime example. So what did Heidegger forget? We will look at Stiegler's and Lyotard's answers to the question of what Heidegger forgot. When it comes to Assmann, the reason that we can inquire into forgetting nonetheless is because she argues that forgetting, even in its most extreme or defensive forms, is never or barely ever complete. So she argues that there is nearly always a mixture at play between remembering and forgetting. And this mixture is furthermore in movement. Or to put it differently, it is in fact when changes to this mixture occur. So regarding the proportions of this mixture, which here then refer to sort of like the pulsations of receding into and returning from forgetting, right? And that can refer both to our individual and collective experience of remembering and forgetting. So it's when there are these changes to this mixture that we can study and inquire into forgetting, Assmann proposes. So the study of forgetting is made possible by way of these sites and moments of transitions in which something changes in the co-composition between remembering and forgetting. And Assmann's work, we can say, at least in part, like looks for these moments of change when it comes to cultural memory, which of course refers to the formation or deformation of collective memory. And there's for sure like a psychoanalytic trace to what she's saying, or like kind of like Freudian undertone, we could say, because for Freud, like put very generally, repression only becomes a problem if it isn't working properly, so to speak. So it's the failures of repression, its shortcomings, its inability to really get rid of something that make it a problem, that needs therapeutic attention, but also, in fact, that it's only in its shortcoming, the shortcomings of repression are the conditions of possibility for perceiving, understanding, and finally thinking repression, right? So were repression to function perfectly, were there no mixture, then we would never know about it, and it would also pose no problem for us. So it's the mixture and imperfection which makes it stand out in the first place, so which makes it appear to us that there even is such a thing as forgetting, and then makes it into a problem for us, and then also brings forth the material that can be, and in fact demands to be worked through in many different processes, some of which are called psychoanalysis, some of which are called philosophy, some of which are called thought, whatever sort of like practice you're engaged in, we could say. All right. So after this general introduction and sort of like some outlines, let's move on at last to our first site, which is a site in ancient Greece, narrated to us through a number of classic Latin writers, however. And that is, of course, Simonides and Themistocles. That is the art of memory and forgetting. So, both Simonides and Themistocles lived in ancient Greece, as I already said. And Simonides was a poet, and we believe he lived from approximately 557 to 467 before the Common Era. And Themistocles was a contemporary of Simonides, who is best known to us because of his political contributions. He was an Athenian military leader and politician who is said to have lived from about 524 until 459 before the Common Era. Apart from his poetry, Simonides is best known for two things. So first of all, he's supposed to have been the first poet who asked for monetary compensation in exchange for his poetry. And so we can find his name mentioned in very derogatory manners in a whole host of texts by his contemporaries and also many that came after him, as he was accused, we might say, for selling out in art, a charge which clearly was just as disreputable back in ancient Greece as it is today. And this sort of like idea of like Simonides being this greedy poet and asking for money or even having gotten very rich out of poetry is sort of like very brilliantly traced by Anne Carson in her book Economy of the Unlost, where she sort of like traces or like contextualizes rather this reading of, the greedy sellout poet Simonides. She contextualizes this reading by way of the kind of elemental upheaval, we could say, that Simonides experienced over the course of his life, because he lived at a time in which ancient Greek society slowly transitioned from a gift economy to an economy based on money, including like a kind of like overlap of these two economies. The second thing that Simonides is best known for is, of course, the origin story narrating the invention of the art of memory, of which Simonides is the hero and inventor. Themistocles, on the other hand, as we will see, is the anti-hero, we can say, of the art of memory's nemesis, which is the art of forgetting. So in order to study the art of memory, there are several classical Latin texts that we can consult. Of course, there's firstly Cicero's De Oratore, which was published in 55 before the Common Era. And we have also this quite extensive anonymous text entitled Ad Herennium from approximately 86 BC. And thirdly, Quintilian's Institutio Oratorio, published around 95 after. And when it comes to Themistocles and the art of forgetting, Cicero is our main source for that, who refers to Themistocles in the Oratore, but also in De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, as well as in the second book of the Academia. So much concerning the classical primary Latin sources on the art of memory and forgetting. But there are also a number of important contemporary texts that have, made the art of memory and the art of forgetting into problems, we can say, like in the best meaning of like philosophical problems for us today, and through whom we receive very forcefully the figures of Simonides as well as Themistocles. And those are, first of all, and I've put them on the first one on the reading list for today, that's Francis Yates' seminal study, The Art of Memory, of course. And I've supplemented Yates with this, I have the German version of the book, but with Harald Weinrich. I've already referred to him a couple of times. Really astonishing book called Lethe, The Art and Critique of Forgetting, as well as Anne Carson's Economy of the Unlost, which is sort of like a reading of Simonides through Paul Celan, the poet Paul Celan. And so I will read these two myths about the art of memory and the art of forgetting through these three contemporary authors. They're sort of like our friends in this. So now, very generally, first, like, what is the art of memory? On the most general level, we can say that it's part of the classical discipline of rhetoric. So it's a technique, even though Francis Yates dislikes this term, employed by a rhetorician to improve one's memory in order to be able to give. So give in the sense of both remember and narrate with inspiration, long speeches with as much freedom as possible, we could say. And as I said, like Yates kind of like dislikes dislikes calling this practice, at least in its classical form, a technique. She calls it the art of memory, because she says that in the way that it was practiced by the Greeks and the Romans, it was more than the later mnemotechnics, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance period, etc., which she also deals with in her book. And the fact that I've already mentioned inspiration already hinted at sort of like the source of where this more comes from. I'm going to quote quickly from the Art of Memory. She writes, "Whilst it is important to recognize that the classical art is based on workable mnemotechnic principles, it may be misleading to dismiss it with the label mnemotechnics. The classical sources seem to be describing inner techniques which depend on visual impressions of almost incredible intensity." So that's what she writes. And so while it's part of the rhetorical tradition, the classical art of memory, according to Yates, centers around the phenomenology of seeing, in fact, seeing one's inner sort of like memory palace, seeing the memories that have been stored as images within a series of places within that memory palace, and letting this inner vision inspire one to the moment of moving one's lip in speech. So it's about the cultivation of an inner vision for Yates, about looking at a series of location with one's inner eye, looking at mental images and letting these images trigger and inspire us. And then she also like points out that this might be very difficult to imagine for a modern person like we are, given that we are surrounded and so used to this world of externalized memory that is so readily available for us, kind of suggesting that we have a rather impoverished inner vision, I guess. And so she kind of suggests that our intellectual lives are so fundamentally different from someone like the ancient Greek poet Simonides, who lived in an oral tradition and had to develop this extraordinarily rich inner life and vision. And, you know, as someone who has read a lot of philosophy of technology, etc., there's of course much to say about the presumption of this difference that Yeats sees here. But anyone who's read also like someone like French anthropologist Leroy-Gourand, or even Derrida, for all that matters, you know, I guess one could deconstruct this difference and argue that, you know, the human is always originally outside itself, and thus dependent and in fact formed by its manifold traces, some of which are technical objects, but also writing, etc., which is preceded by manifold, like everyday objects, technical objects, ever since the Paleolithicum. But we will speak more about this in the next seminar. So what does all of this have to do with Simonides? The story of how the art of memory was invented goes the following. There was a celebration in the year 500 before the Common Era, and this celebration provides the framework for the myth of the invention of the ars memoria. A boxer called Scopas had won a boxing match, and he had invited the famous poet Simonides of Chios to attend the celebration and compose for the occasion of Scopas' victory a poem. Now, the poem itself did not survive the course of time, but the story of what happened during this celebration has been handed down to us. And I will read out a section from Cicero's De Oratore, translated by Anne Carson. She writes, well, she translates what Cicero wrote. Once Simonides was dining at Granon in Thessaly at the house of the rich and noble Scopas. He had composed a song in honor of this man, and in it he put a lot of typical ornamental material concerning Castor and Polydoicus, so often also referred under the name Castor and Pollux. Whereas Scopas ungenerously declared that he would pay Simonides only half the fee they had agreed on for the song. The other half he should get from the gods, whom he had praised to that extent. Just then, Simonides received a message that the two young men were asking for him at the front door on a matter of urgent business. He got up and went out, but found no one there. Meanwhile, the roof of the room in which Scopas was dining collapsed, killing him and his friends. Now, when the kinsfolk of these people wished to bury them, they found it impossible to recognize the remains. But Simonides, it is said, by remembering the exact place where each man had sat at the table, was able to identify them all for burial. From this, he discovered that it is order that mainly contributes to memory its light. I am grateful to Simonides of Chios, who thus invented, so they say, the art of memory. So we know that the ars memoria begin with a catastrophe. At the beginning of the art of memory stands a catastrophe of death and destruction. The roof housing the celebration has collapsed, and everyone, apart from Simonides, who had been mysteriously called to the front door and stands sort of like on the stoop, we could say, of the house, has perished and been buried under the rubble. The pre-story is, of course, that Simonides, the first poet to have asked for money in exchange for his poetry, had composed a poem in celebration of Scopas, but having laudated not only Scopas, but also the brother deities, Castor and Pollux, Scopas wanted to pay only 1/3 of the agreed sum and told Simonides, well, each source says 1/3 or 1/2, anyways, only a part of the agreed sum, and told Simonides to ask the brother deities for the rest of his fee. Having been called to the door just before the roof collapsed, and Carson proposes that in a sense, Castor and Pollux fulfilled their obligation towards Simonides and paid him by saving his life. Scopas, on the other hand, is punished for having so fundamentally misunderstood poetry, proposing that the art of poetry could be remunerated quantitatively, 1 coin for 1 word, and death was his punishment. Following the catastrophe of death and destruction, the house in rebels, everyone dead, Simonides passed on a 2-fold gift. The first gift provided by Simonides responded to the catastrophe, which was, apart from everyone's death, also the fact that the deceased were disfigured to the extent that their family and loved ones could not identify and thus claim their dead for burial. And I'm not sure now, Austin, if this is true, but I think that in like later down the line, like I think we're gonna, especially with the psychoanalytical notions of forgetting, we're gonna come to the question of mourning and burial, etc. later on. Here, in sort of like the ancient Greek sites that we're dealing with, Simonides' exceptional visual memory allowed to identify each attendee, each guest, by their location around the dinner table alone. And so this was the gift of remembering certain particular names and their locations. This particular gift has like a more general counterpart, you could say, which transcends the particular catastrophe which had befallen Scopas and his guests. Because with this particular gift of remembering the names of each person around the dinner table, Simonides bequeathed on us the art of memory in general, right? Of connecting words or images or the memory of someone to locations in our minds alone. But differently to everyone else that practices the art of memory after him, and we know that there have been many. In fact, when I started my doctorate, my supervisor in our first session told me that now is really the time, if I haven't already done so, to start cultivating my own memory palace. So differently to everyone else that comes after Simonides, Simonides' memory palace was not artificially constructed or constructed at will at all. Simonides had sat around the dinner table with the rest of the guests and Scopas. And it is this dinner table that is buried under the rubble following the catastrophe. This dinner table became his theater of memory, we could say, his memory palace, as we call it nowadays. He had had dinner with the guests, and every single one of them had perished. So for Carson, and it's really very beautiful if you want to read her Economy of the Unlost. For Carson, Simonides' gift of naming the dead based on their location in the room points to the function of poetry as a whole in ancient Greece. And this function of poetry, she argues, is memorable naming. So etymologically speaking, the noun, the ancient Greek noun neme, is closely related to mnemeskomai, which means I remember, I name, I mention. And of course, both of those are related to the goddess Mnemosyne, so the goddess of memory, the mother of the muses, including the music and poetry. And had Simonides not named Scopas, not remembered the name of every single one of the guests at the dinner table, had he not composed his poems about them and named them, they would have been forgotten, right? So the art of memory in its relation to poetry resists forgetting in a twofold way, and Carson works out. It resists this very particular forgetting on the one hand, which is quantifiable because it refers in this case to the remembering of all the dinner guests, for instance. But on the other hand, the art of memory overcomes forgetting in a more general way as well, when it is brought here in relation to poetry, because the speech of the poet has the power, we could say, to call upon the divine aspect of memory, which resists quantification in the way that the first particular form of remembering does, because it differentiates between oblivion and fame, between being forgotten and remembered as part of history. And the only way why we still know about Skopas or any of that is because of poetry. So practically speaking, what does the art of memory consist of? Like, how can we imagine it? To begin with, it's important to understand that we're dealing with a body of knowledge, an art that is organized. So it's organized according to and deals with a number of rules, which can be taught to others and are meant to be taught to others. So as an art that possesses a certain level of formalization, and because of that, it can be passed on. And in fact, all of the texts that we have, so the three sort of like ancient Latin sources that I mentioned at the beginning, they're all, in German we say Lehrtexte, so they all have a doctrinal aim, right? They all sort of are there to teach a student how to acquire the art of memory. So this art then, what does it consist of? It consists essentially of three elements, I would say. Firstly, places, so ancient Greek topoi or Latin loci, images, phantasmata or imaginas, and thirdly, order, as you know, we've already heard in this quote from Cicero, which in ancient Greek is cosmos or ordo in Latin. So the topos, the places, must be of deep familiarity. We know. As a beginner, we could say we should not construct our own. So it should not be an artificially constructed memory place. It is easier, supposedly, to internalize the plan of an already existing house or palace. And the places, so the topoi within that house, need to be arranged in a sequential order, like seats around a dinner table, or a corridor that we can walk down and sort of like, you know, exit to a number of rooms, and a house, or like a museum, a library with many different rooms, something like that. We will come to the idea of constructing an inner house or a mental building in our second part on Kant. But for now, we can say that the art of memory is at heart a spatial topological art. And individual memories are then transformed, so this is very important, into images, phantasmata, and placed into these topoi. So they're connected, but only ever temporarily with a place. So you transform a memory into an image, and then you deposit that image into a place, and then the poet or the memory artist or, you know, the public speaker can mentally walk through in your mind each room in the sequential order and recall the memory associated with each place. And there are many, you know, stories about very famous memory artists like Seneca, for instance, is supposed to have possessed such great memory and such great skill regarding his memory palace that he would ask his students to line up, and then it would be up to 200, and each of them would tell him a word, and he would sort of like deposit them in his memory palace. But then he could recite the sequence of the order both backwards and forwards. That seems to have been a sign of like incredible mastery, because the sequence of the room is highlighted in all of these texts over and over again. Yeah, the ability to jump back and forth, or to sort of like, have shortcuts from one room to another, or even walk backwards and remember the images, memories, and orders, supposed to have been quite difficult. So for Yeats, what these three elements, so like places, images, and the order, sort of like point to, is that in fact the art of memory consists of a number of translations, I would say. So it's an essentially oratory art, right? It takes something that was heard and deposits what was heard in the form of images into a certain mental place, in order to then, on an occasion, translate those images into speech again, as one walks through the places and looks at these images, which then inspire and sort of like give the words to the speaker. And the place retains the image in the way that a wax tablet does, meaning that you can reuse the same topology of places, the same memory palace. The topoi remain, while the images can and will change depending on the occasion. So if you have deposited certain images in your memory palace, you've like kind of traced them into the wax. If you don't retrace them, then they're just going to disappear, but you can also smoothen out the wax tablet, etc. The order, as I've already said, is central. Cicero has pointed this out. And the Latin term for it is ordo, which means arrangement or exact positioning. And the author of Aeternium, the anonymous author, employs the analogy of writing in order to expound the functioning of the art of memory. I'm just going to quickly quote from that. The places, the anonymous author writes, are very much like wax tablets or papyrus. The images, like letters. The arrangement and disposition of the images, like the script. And the delivery, like the reading. So this is, of course, one way of translating, I guess, the functioning of the memory palace, and comparing it to writing. But Anne Carson supplements the analogy of the script when it comes to order with the ancient Greek notion of the cosmos. And of course, the cosmos can, and in fact does, denote many different kinds of order, right? So the cosmos can be like, or can like, refers to order on all these different levels, like planetary order, governmental order, social order, etc. And she writes, so the cosmos, she writes, is as if all the different strands of human and natural complication in the world were woven out of one texture, extending over both space and time. As he, and here she means Simonides, lingers on the doorstep of what had been Scopa's house, and stares at the smoking ruin of the dining hall. Simonides is contemplating a piece of the texture that exists nowhere but in his own mind. So I think it's quite interesting to what the kind of like recourse to the ancient Greek cosmos means here, because rather than it being a translation or an introjection of an external order, as was proposed by Francis Yates or also by the author of Ad Herennium, I think the Greek cosmos, the notion of the Greek cosmos here allows N. Carson to somehow make a more fundamental argument about the texture in which also the art of memory partakes. Interestingly, however, N. Carson does not refer to Simonides' famous encounter with Themistocles, the politician and military commander who made Athens the strongest naval power of the Mediterranean during his lifetime. But Weinrich and Yates, Weinrich longer, but and Yates in passing, remember both that Cicero recalls their meeting at several occasions throughout the text that Cicero's text that has been left for us to read. And it was Simonides, Cicero tells us, who once offered Themistocles to teach him his famous art of memory. But Cicero points out that Themistocles was in fact a famous rhetorician himself and had an excellent natural memory, so excellent in fact that he was plagued by the rare but nonetheless seemingly very painful misfortune of being incapable of forgetting. Themistocles' natural memory was so developed that he seems to have retained too much rather than too little. For instance, there's the story that he remembered the name of every single Athenian, for instance, and had such great memory that even he was exiled at a certain moment. Even in very old age, he could converse with people who spoke the most diverse languages because he had this, like, we could say, like, unnatural ability of memory retention. And so Themistocles famously declined Simonides' offer with the answer that he would much rather learn to forget at will rather than to remember. And so the story goes, according to Cicero, that this is how the idea of an ars oblivionis, so an art of forgetting, was born, which is, of course, the speculative counterpart to the ars memoria. And we do not know what the rules, the ancient rules of such an art would have looked like, or even, how it could function. And there's a famous, very short article by Umberto Eco called An Ars Oblivionalis, Forget It, ! Where Umberto Eco decries such an art of forgetting as a categorical impossibility and asks about the nature of its impossibility. And he says that it might well be possible to employ mnemotechnics to confuse or forget memories through, for instance, like overriding or lack of order, or just through trying really hard to remember very badly. But for Eco, there can be no such thing as an ars oblivionalis or a Lethe technics, so Lethe techniques. There are, he writes, no voluntary devices for forgetting. And so the question is, what would an art of forgetting look like, of course? And in order to carry this question further, I propose to move on to our second side, which is that of Immanuel Kant. And deal with forgetting in more detail. And the reason that I think Kant is quite interesting when it comes to the question of forgetting and also the question of an art of forgetting is because we have really detailed, very long data, we could say, writings in the form of texts. We know that there's a very long history in which the history of philosophy has tried to, as it were, like immunize itself to the threat of forgetting, which is here Kant's forgetting. Because in the end of his life, Kant, we're told, was subject to substantial memory decline. We would today say that he had slowly become senile. And so the question that anyone working with these late writings of Kant is, of course, if one makes one's way through the late writings of Kant, and in particular of the very last manuscript that he worked on over the last 10 years of his life, which we refer to under the name Opus Posthumum, is one witness to the evolution of Kant's transcendental philosophy, or rather to its atrophy. And this question is all more urgent because we know that there are two letters in which Kant reports of a painful late realization that his philosophical system was faulty. He had come to believe that there was a fault in his philosophical system because it was endangered by a gap. And so most of scholarship working on this late manuscript commences from the belief that Kant's work on this manuscript was motivated in order to remedy this gap. And in the scholarship, the existence or non-existence of this gap remains disputed. There are some readers of the manuscript who, try to identify the gap. Unfortunately, Kant does not spell out where exactly he locates this gap. And others, many others, we have to say, rejected the very proposition of there being such a gap on the argument that his system of, his critical system was perfect and was in no need of any remedy. And so while the question of the gap, including its relationship to the manuscript, so what exactly the manuscript tried to bridge, we could say, is the subject of a lot of scholarly debates, both historical as well as of the present. There's no decisive thing we can say about it, I would argue. It's nonetheless clear that as Kant started working on the manuscript, the way in which he envisioned this project itself transformed over the last 10 years of his life until he eventually passed away in February of 1804. So he started writing he stopped writing sometime around 1803 and then passed away in the beginning of 1804. So we also know that the end of the manuscript is not, where Kant wanted to arrive at. And so if there was indeed a gap within his system, Kant did not manage to complete it. And so the question is indeed very pressing. So when one reads this last manuscript, is one witness, given now that we know a little bit about the problem of the gap, and given that we know a little bit about his supposed senility, so if one reads this last manuscript, is one witness to Kant's sort of ruthless critique of his earlier transcendental philosophy in his attempt of remedying this threatening gap? Or is one witness to the atrophy of Kant's mind due to his forgetfulness, where he started, seeing gaps where there were none, and in fact engaged in a lengthy destruction of his critical system, and so we would do well to ignore this last manuscript. I would like to tell you a little bit about the long history of post-Kantian scholarship and its attempt of identifying and diagnosing Kant's senility, because it's quite interesting. So we know that there are these three biographers, all of whom were friends of Kant. We often refer to them in Kant scholarship as the Nicolovius biographers. Borowski, Jachmann, and Wasianski, they're called. And we know from them, so they published their biographies on Kant, I think like the year after Kant passed away. And they all tell us that a certain forgetfulness started to set in. But they all say it started to set in at a different place. So Jachmann said that unfortunately, Kant's memory decline started as early as 1795. And so even 1 year before Kant even stopped teaching. Wasianski claims that in fact, Kant's memory was never very good. But differently to Jachmann, he says, nevertheless, we must distinguish between his usual bad memory and his unusual senile bad memory. And for him, it only became senile in 1802, so only 2 years before his death. Borowski also says that Kant had always been forgetful, but again, puts a different date. So we know from these three people that most likely they cite really quite funny anecdotes of Kant's forgetfulness during his life, that he might have always been forgetful, and that another kind of forgetfulness, a senile forgetfulness, set in at a certain moment, but each of them dates that senile setting in differently. The reception history of the Opus Posthumum, so of this last manuscript, has been tightly interwoven and influenced by this reported senility. Wasianski, so one of the three biographers, also functioned as Kant's executor following his death. And we can read in his biography that at certain moments, Kant referred to this last manuscript as nearly finished, but at certain other moments, he also wanted this manuscript to be burned after his death. And so Wasianski interpreted this to mean that in fact, Kant's mental powers had so diminished over the last years of his life that he had himself become incapable of judging the merits and the importance of his work. And so this was a problem for Wasianski, because once he had become his executor, he didn't know how to deal with this manuscript, which was in quite a rough state, had all these different fascicles. It was sort of like, you have to imagine, like Kant kept this manuscript with him all the time, and he wrote on it all the time, and just the sheets that were on top were just the historically closest sheets, and the further you would go down, they were older and older sheets, but it has like dozens of introductions, dozens of different outlines. It was still in a rather rough state, one could say. And so Wasianski didn't quite know how to deal with this manuscript, and so he handed the manuscript over to a quite prominent Kantian who was also a friend of Kant called Schulz, who inspected the manuscript and then advised against the publication, because he said that not even the introduction was finished, and so we would do best to somehow not publish it. And so Wasianski decided against publishing the manuscript. And as Italian reader of the Opus Posthumum called Giovanni Pietro Basile, a very nice man, points out, the thing is that Wasianski did more than merely decide against the edition and publication of Kant's last manuscript, because in fact he made for a very long time the manuscript disappear without a trace. And so it was gone. It was not to be included in the Kant canon. We know that Waziański didn't do it, out of like, he wasn't mean or anything. He most likely tried to protect Kant and his philosophy, but nevertheless, it wasn't read and it wasn't distributed. And so following the first sort of like faithful assessment of the manuscripts, a rather prominent 19th century historian of philosophy, Kuno Fischer, argued rather polemically, without ever having inspected the manuscript, because no one at a certain moment even knew where it was, that the manuscript should be ignored as a whole, since it is testament to Kant's deteriorating mental condition. And then he repeated that several years later, where he referred to the late Kant as a decaying spirit. But he was not the only one interpreting the writing of the late Kant as the product of senility. So there is a whole culture, I would say, of Kant interpretation, in which Kant's senility, which was, like I said, first mentioned by the three Nicolovius biographers, is in fact employed as an explanatory framework for difficult passages in Kant's text. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples here. So Hans Aigner took recourse to what he calls a Blattversetzungsthese, so a thesis that a certain sheet got lost in the manuscript in relation, for example, to Kant's 1784 Prolegomena. There are difficult passages in this text, he argues, and we can only make sense of these difficult passages in this text if we believe that they are a consequence of Kant's failure to notice that, in fact, the order of his text had been corrupted in the editing or printing process. Or Schopenhauer, for Schopenhauer, Kant's doctrine of right, and so the second part of his 1797 Metaphysics of Morals is a product of Kant's senility. He also wrote a letter to Karl Rosenkranz in 1837, which was then, even though it was initially a private letter, printed 1 year later in the introduction to the 1838 Rosenkranz edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. So in this letter, Schopenhauer went so far to argue that the changes undertaken by Kant in the B edition of the Critique of Pure Reason are the product of Kant's senility. He calls this Altersschwäche. But it's not only like in historical Kant scholarship that, Kant's forgetfulness is taken sort of like as a framework for interpreting difficult passages. No one reads the Prolegomena or the B edition as a product or as compromised by Kant's senility anymore, but there's nevertheless a logic that can nevertheless be found in reference to Kant's late philosophy also today. And there's many examples for that, but I'm just going to give one, which is maybe the most striking. And it's also not to discredit his work altogether, but nonetheless, there's the seminal biography by Manfred Kühn from 2003, where he claims that already in the 1798 Conflict of the Faculties, you can see Kant's mental powers decline, and he simply did not possess the same energy or power anymore than in his earlier writing. So there is this culture of reading Kant symptomatically and explaining difficult passages in the text by way of Kant's diminished state of mind. And of course, like I already proposed, this can nowhere be seen better than in reference to this last manuscript called the Opus Posthumum. So we know that eventually the Opus Posthumum got introduced into the Kant edition. There's an interesting reception history, which I can't go into right now, because between the disappearance of the manuscript, like in the year after Kant's death, and then the eventual publication of the manuscript as part of the Academy edition of Kant in the year 1936 and 1938 in 2 parts, there's like, what is that, like 130 years have passed, but nevertheless, eventually it got included. And it got included because of the work of someone called Erich Adikas. And his argument for including was that the last fascicle, so the chronologically last fascicle, was in fact complete in the year 1801, nearly complete in 1801, and so at a time when Kant had still been in good enough health. And so this argument by Atticus, which he made because he was able, he got the manuscript, it hadn't been destroyed, and it had been completely shuffled, like all the papers were like really messed up, and he somehow was able to establish the chronological order of it, and then he made an argument, which I'm going to present a little bit, at least the outline of, that in fact he had only become senile by 1801. So he reads the last fascicle philologically. We could say he pays a lot of philological attention to it, and says that it's in this last fascicle, so in the last kind of chapter, that you can see a senility and in its most clear form. And his argument, for instance, is that over more than 2 years, Kant only filled 120 print pages, and thus substantially less than his supposed pre-senile pensum. Also, he argues that there's more and more crossed out words, indicating that Kant now has problems finding the proper word for what he wishes to express. And finally, then he writes, Kant has become incapable of finishing full sentences. So he interprets this, that Kant finds it difficult to think and write at all, taking more and more recourse to abbreviations. And finally, you can find all these single words. And I'm quickly going to quote from Atticus. He writes, "Without a doubt, Kant lacks the necessary ability to conceive a larger whole, not only in vague outlines, but also to execute this plan step by step and expand it in detail. It would have required a certain minimum level of concentration and creative power, which Kant no longer possesses. Even on favorable days, his mental and physical powers rapidly weaken during work, and instead of completing what he has started, he begins anew, only to suffer the same fate once again." So Atticus is not the only one who makes this argument about fascicle 1. Also, one of the editors, Gerhard Lehmann, reads in general the Opus Posthumum as containing important philosophical developments of transcendental philosophy, but fascicle 1 is clearly senile. He calls it Alterspsychose, a senile psychosis. And he makes an interesting argument, especially from sort of like the point of view of philosophy of technics, because he says that in fascicle 1, we are witness to increasingly mechanical associative relations between representations in Kant's thought. Sometimes they are playful, but sometimes he seems to, you can really see that they are compulsive, he writes. So Kant now must have found himself trapped in these mechanical thought processes when he was writing fascicle 1. And then he says, and now we can see that clearly writing for Kant functioned as a means of remembering rather than thinking and inventing. And of course, it's a very interesting distinction, you know, writing to remember and writing to invent, etc. And at the same time, there's like a really sort of like marginal, but nevertheless very interesting, slim tradition that already began to write and publish like medical physiological assessments of Kant's senility. So I'm talking here about medical journals who take Kant as a case study for senility, devoid any medical data or any trace of any medical assessment. So we know that there's this tradition of medical papers about Kant's senility from 1872 onwards, and there are medical articles we can read on that. Now, there's a really excellent work by Kantian called Maya Scheppelmann, from the year 2018 called Der senile Kant, zur Widerlegung einer populären These, the senile Kant, a refutation of a popular thesis. Unfortunately, it's not translated into English yet. But of course, the aim of this book was to refute this common claim that Kant was senile towards the end of his life. And she offers two ways of refuting this this claim. One is that she proposes that in fact Kant had anonymously published to a much larger extent than usually assumed over the last decade of his life. So this is the one path in which she refutes the senility thesis. And the second path is that what we had hitherto believed to have been facts about Kant's physical and mental condition, in fact, derived from handed down statements from a context that she characterizes as Kant's supposed circle of opponents and enemies. So I can't go into details here, but basically she makes a rather convincing philological argument that there are 500 published pages of Kant over the last decade of his life. So one of them is a 150-page long refutation of Fichte. And lots of the arguments about Kant's senility also suggest that, you know, in the end of his life, Kant couldn't really read anyone else's philosophy anymore. He wasn't, his mind had become so crystalline and stuck that he wasn't really able to engage in anyone else's thought anymore. So she argues, no, look, there's a 150-page long refutation of Fichte proving Kant's deep familiarity with the Fichtean system. And then on the other hand, she also makes an argument that there's this 350-page long book on Herder, sort of like in which Kant responded to the Metacritic himself, which was anonymously published in the year 1800. And the second path of refuting the senility hypothesis analyzes this documentary evidence about Kant's supposed senility and sort of like traces it back to its origins. And Schäpelmann argues that all these cited documents derive from very particular contexts, and we need to name these contexts. And the most important historical context regarding Kant's senility is, she argues, the context of Kant's enemies and opponents. And these, for her, are Fichte, Schelling, Pörschke, Reinhardt, and Beck, all of whom suggested already before, as well as after Kant's death to varying degrees, that imperfections in Kant's system are, in fact, nothing but the product of Kant's elderly age, whereby attempting to damage, essentially, Kant's philosophical reputation by way of spreading these rumors about his elderly condition and increasing senility. At the same time, you know, Schäpelmann does not deny that Kant had himself been afflicted by what she calls a virulent forgetfulness. And then there might have been like further physiological restrictions towards the end of his life. But for Schäpelmann, Kant was able to resist this purely bodily phenomenon of forgetfulness by way of the strength of his will. That is her argument. So we know that Kant produced a myriad of notes, and he had this habit of writing into this notebook, which he called memoria and Büchlein, so memory booklet, but especially like notes, like he just wrote notes on everything, everywhere. But also in the Opus Posthumum, we see like a lot of sort of like, there are a lot of things he writes just in order to remind himself of something later on. So for Schäpelmann, this practice of excessive note-taking for the sake of remembering, should be read as Kant's intention of confronting his physical weakness by way of the strength of the will and of his understanding. That is her argument. So she does this also on a methodological level by critiquing the conflation of Kant the thinker on the one hand and Kant the person. Such a cross-reading and a conflation of Kant the person and the philosopher, she argues, was first performed and made acceptable again by critics of Kant, like, for instance, Schopenhauer and Hegel. And so the least one could do is sort of like problematize the context in which these kind of arguments, so the socio-political context in which these arguments first appeared and were made acceptable, but also, of course, to what end these arguments were made, you know, we could add. So sort of like looking back at this like history, you know, of references to Kant's senility, we could say that what we see emerge here is this kind of like curious double discourse, which first appeared with Kant's biographies in 1804 by the Nicolovius biographers, and sort of like affects Kant scholarship until today. So what do I mean with this idea of a double discourse? The double discourse is, of course, that there are certain writings by Kant, especially the last manuscript, which is not to be read philosophically, because it is the product, it's an example of a senile mind. And so the manuscript should be read purely symptomatically rather than critically or as an instance of a, you know, universal discourse. And so the manuscript, because of this distinction between symptomatic and particular and like, you know, healthy and universal, was not included in the corpus of Kant's properly philosophical work. The manuscript is read as the product of Kant's own forgetfulness, and so should itself be forgotten. And much of the reception history, you know, work towards the exclusion of this manuscript from the Kant's corpus. So this is sort of like the first bifurcation of the discourse on Kant's philosophical writings. And then each author, you know, if we sort of like trace the history of the 19th century Kant reception, we can say that there's like a million of like symptomatic readings put forth by all these individual authors, each shifting the line across which the discourse bifurcates into clinical pathological on the one side and critical universal, like back and forth, sometimes as early as to the B edition, so 1787 of the Critique of Pure Reason. And sometimes, you know, as with Atticus, he managed to sort of like shift the line into the manuscript itself to 1801, and so allowed for the last manuscript to be included in the Kant corpus. Sorry, is there a question?
I just had a quick question, but I didn't mean to interrupt, sorry.
No, please, sorry. I'm just, I could speak for hours. Yeah.
I can wait for a while if it's better. I don't mind.
No, if you want to contribute something, I would love to hear it.
I was only curious as to whether so I was thinking also that all of the people that you mentioned who were critiquing Kant specifically on the basis of like a degradation of memory seem to also be post-Kantians. Would this have had anything to do with trying to, for instance, salvage the Kantian kind of framework or the idealist framework from the critiques of Jacobi that were coming around the same time? Or was it kind of more like sort of competitiveness, intra sort of academic competitiveness or something, trying to, you know, I don't know. It seems like it would be convenient to say that the reason is not the failure of the system itself, but rather the failure of the individual that wrote the system, and the system itself needs to still be completed. Would this be a possible interpretation? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think I spoke about this with my supervisor quite a lot, and I think if you look at sort of like, you know, the group of people that I mentioned, they all have different relations to Kant. Some are clearly post-Kantian, so they critique the Kantian system, but ultimately work from within a Kantian framework. Some of them are like German idealists and actually want to distance themselves from Kant, etc. But what kind of combines them is the problem that this last manuscript poses. Because if you are a Kantian, a devout Kantian, or if you're a post-Kantian, it's a problem for you, especially from the 20th century, from the perspective of the 20th century, if you didn't know about the manuscript, because the entire, sorry, I need to make this argument in a more systematic manner. So he passed away in 1804. No one knew about this manuscript until, well, it was published in like small parts in a magazine. Some people looked at it, but really we could say it was only published and made available to the public, you know, in the 1930s, which has its own particular meaning, of course, because it was National Socialism in Germany, just to bring this back up. But and so imagine if you're a 20th century philosopher, if you are post-Kantian, this means that the entire sort of like reception history of Kant in the 19th century, you know, could not take recourse to this last work, and so has this massive hole in it. And then if you look at the manuscript, you see that the manuscript is really changing fundamental tenets of transcendental philosophy. For instance, it critiques the subject-object divide. It introduces the idea of technical practical reason. Like there's many sort of like fundamental changes that are made that in many respects are more critical of the transcendental framework than some of the voices of German idealism. So it's like, from the perspective of being a Kantian, it's a problem because it seems like Kant destroyed his own system, reworked it fundamentally in the end of his life. If you are someone who works on German idealism and so have educated your mind, your thinking through the work of people who responded very critically to Kant, then you're confronted with a manuscript that is more critical than Schelling, for instance, or Hegel. And then you have the problem of the threat of forgetfulness, which is, I have not come to the end of that because it's really rather interesting, sort of like how that plays itself out, you know. It's like, it's this manuscript is one of those pressure points that articulates the history of philosophy across itself in what I find a really fascinating manner. And that's why I kind of keep on coming back to it. And there's just so much interesting stuff there. Also, especially on, you know, what you've pointed out, or what I've tried to sort of like organize a bit more now, on how it challenges the history of post-Kantian thought on all levels. It's not only that, you know, it challenges German idealism's reception of Kant, it also challenges neo-Kantianism, post-Kantianism, just like everyone, because Isabel Stengers, she has in one text she wrote about Simondon, Gilbert Simondon, this 20th century thinker or philosopher, who also was published only so late in his life, right? And in part even passed away before the entirety even of his doctorate was published. She says, the problem with someone like Simondon is that his work comes to us in a time capsule. And so it never even had the ability of entering a discourse with his contemporaries. And so with Simondon, the problem there is that it seems that his questions come out of nowhere. It seems that they were only maybe his questions, because we don't understand, because there is no discussion with his contemporaries on how they articulated, how they related to all that other stuff that goes on around them. Sorry, this is a really long bracket on Simondon and Stengers. But in a certain sense, I think it's it's a useful image also for what this late Kant manuscript does, because we know that the 19th century, you know, is the century of like intense Kant criticism, but it did not take into account this last work. It excluded it, it excludes it. And now if we read it, it seems to make a void out of a lot of this criticism, because it is itself so fundamentally challenging. And so it seems, even to this day, and that if you attend a Kant conference, for instance, you know, like one of those big conferences, there's like all these different tracks on the you know, depending on how his work is temporalized, and there might be like, you know, 100 of papers on critical philosophy, blah, blah, and then there's maybe like 2 papers on the opus posthumum, if even. Like to this day, it has this marginal role, because also it seems so difficult to enter into a conversation with contemporary debates on certain issues in the critical philosophy, because how do you relate with an author who has become post-Kantian himself, essentially, right? That is the kind of interesting methodological, there are so many interesting methodological questions and questions about the history of philosophy, etc. But I shall return to the question of the double discourse that you can sort of trace if you look at the history of philosophy through the lens of Kant's senility. And it's interesting. So I've said that, you know, it was established with the Kant biographers, and then if you look at the 19th century, you can see each of them shift that double discourse back and forth. Each of them sort of has to make that demarcation line. Some shifted into the opus posthumum, so the last manuscript. Some say it's much earlier, but even Schepelmann, so who's, you know, this really brilliant Kantian and involved with the working through with the manuscript currently in Potsdam to make a new edition of the opus posthumum. It appears to me that she shifted the bifurcation line out of Kant's philosophical work in its entirety, even though we have to say she did not write about the opus posthumum at all, which is interesting on its own. But then she moves on to resurrect it in order to mark a rather curious difference between Kant's body and mind. So I'm going to quote from her quickly when she writes, "The following can be presumed. Kant increasingly suffers from age-related, thus senile forgetfulness, but he can counteract it through aids, Hilfsmittel. It would have had a much greater impact on his daily life than on the papers of the thinker. It is appropriate to differentiate, in the last years, between the weak body and forgetful mind on the one hand, and the strong will and power of thought of Kant on the other." End quote. So it seems that she upholds a really strong, very curious body-mind split when it comes to Kant. And so in the end, she shifts this line, this bifurcation line of the discourse, into pathological and universal, or like particular and critical. She shifts it to enact a difference between Kant's physical life, which is now read only symptomatically, and then his intellectual philosophical life, which is supposedly entirely unaffected by, you know, the pathologies that have befallen its physical counterpart. And so looking at these like manifold attempts of Kant scholarship to distinguish between the healthy and the senile Kant are indicative of the threats. And that's ultimately why I'm telling you all of this, that forgetting and forgetfulness pose to the universal project of philosophy as a whole, not just when it comes to Kant. But it is, of course, also indicative of the threat that forgetting and forgetfulness pose to the universal project of Kant's philosophy. And we can see this most clearly in the fact that none of these thinkers, be it Atticus, Lehmann, or even Schepelmann herself, ever asked what Kant himself had to say about remembering and forgetting as philosophical concepts. And so I believe that we would do well to remember to ask this question at this point. So is it not precisely from the perspective of a philosophy of forgetting which is a double genitive, meaning that both terms are engaged in a disputation as both the subject and the object respectively, that we need to locate ourselves at in order to study this difficult, problematic phenomenon of forgetting, which has, all these different manifestations, as I've tried to quickly lay out through Assmann in the introduction. So in order to be able to do that, don't we need to look, first of all, what Kant wrote about forgetting and remembering, respectively? So what is the relationship between Kant's philosophy of forgetting and his supposed forgetting of philosophy? That is, in a way, the question. So I've spoken about the ancient practice of the art of memory, right? And of course, I know that there's centuries lying between Cicero and Kant, and there are a million of different sites that traverse that time. And I don't have, of course, time to trace them. I had to make a decision and I decided to jump. But I understand that it would be completely impossible to understand the manifold and very layered critiques, as well as the inventions and revolutions brought about by the Enlightenment, which was, of course, the context that Kant was writing in, without referring, at least very briefly, to the invention of the printing press in the year 1436, which for us, or maybe I should rather say for me, here, as part of, a certain mode of Western Occidental thought, it marks the beginning of the modern era. So the printing press fundamentally changed natural anamnesic memory, and I will hopefully have time to speak a little bit more about that in the next seminar in order to sort of like take that a bit apart. But for now, I'm just gonna briefly quote Elena Esposito, who is a systems theorist and wrote a lot on the change of memory through technical inventions, etc. I'm quickly gonna quote from her. She writes that memory based on texts, she writes, is much stronger than the memory of the rhetorical tradition, which relies primarily on orality because it leaves out much more data, so it forgets much more, but allows for considering an incomparably greater variety of situations, and so it remembers much more. It is an abstract memory that relies on forgetting rather than directly on the capacity for remembering in order to enhance memory. So, end quote. So, Esposito, but also many others, they argue that from the invention of the printing press onwards, one can observe a devaluation and eventually disappearance of natural memory practices. And one can also see that for instance, Francis Yates' book, The Art of Memory, it ends at a certain moment. So there's a certain devaluation and eventual disappearance of natural memory practices, including the practice of the art of memory, in favor of a renewed and increased reflection and focus on forgetting with the beginning of the modern era. And so going back to Aleida Assmann, she also interprets philosophical modernity, and in particular the Enlightenment period, as above all a renewed reflection on the meaning and role of forgetting. So this can be already seen in the works of Montaigne, Francis Bacon, Descartes, but for today's seminar, but I think also for me, in my reading of that history, it can nowhere be seen better than in the work of Kant. Because in opposition to scholastic doctrinal philosophy, so the philosophy that Kant himself had been educated in, and its accompanying focus on memory and the system of philosophy, Kant put forth this image of Enlightenment reason and the practice of philosophizing as aligned with a ruthless critique of these inherited systems of philosophy. So a ruthless critique of the authority of these inherited systems for the sake of the autonomy of thought, of thinking for oneself. And I put this quote from Weinrich in the description of the seminar, where he writes, "Only by turning away from memory, as it still prevailed in the pre-existing doctrinal philosophy, could Kant become the great destroyer in the realm of thoughts and the all-crushing." So Kant's critical philosophy, so his contribution to the Enlightenment, we could say his propedeutic, was aimed at heart at the critical quasi-destruction of philosophy's so-called house of reason, so the memory palace of philosophy, out of which and in relation to which philosophy perceived, understood, and thought, and which was also, of course, the structure of thought, so the canon, which every student of philosophy had to learn as part of the study, philosophical study. So unfortunately, we have only 15 minutes left, but I will quickly unpack at least this point a little. So Kant discusses his critical approach, so what he means by critique, in the two prefaces and the introductions to his Critique of Pure Reason, Kritik der reinen Vernunft. And the double genitive in the title of the work points, of course, to the complexity of the undertaking, because there's an uncertainty of the who and the what in the grammatical structure. So it's not only a critique of pure reason in the sense of subjecting pure reason to critique, it's at the same time pure reason itself that carries out this critique. We're thus dealing with what would be called a self-critique, in which an internally differentiated reason is at once the court of justice, the judge, and the accused themselves. And so we can ask sort of like, what has occasioned these extraordinary measures? What crimes has reason committed to provoke its own trial in that manner? And reason's self-critique, Kant claims, is necessary in order to settle, and he believes he will settle them once and for all, what he calls the endless controversies fought out in the battlefield called metaphysics, which are slowly driving the former queen of all the sciences into ruin. Brought about by reason's very own fate, so reason's Schicksal, reason is said to be, and I quote, burdened with questions which it cannot dismiss, since they're given to it as problems by the nature of reason itself, but which it also cannot answer, since they transcend every faculty of human reason. And of course, the questions that Kant is referring to here are the three metaphysical questions of, does God exist? What is the nature of being? Where did the world begin, right? So sort of like questions that are of the special metaphysics. And so these questions are given to reason by its nature itself, but at the same time, he suggests that they exceed what reason is capable of legitimately answering. And so it's a paradoxical predicament, since reason has no one to blame but itself for this dilemma. And the source of the problem, and this is sort of where we come back to the idea of the house of reason, is that reason is subject to what he calls a drive for expansion. And this drive for expansion, Trieb zur Erweiterung, plunges reason in ever further obscurity and contradictions. And ultimately down the line, once we arrive in the history of philosophy with Kant, they warrant these extraordinary measures of reason's self-critique, which is the project of the Critique of Pure Reason. And so the way that the Critique of Pure Reason ventures to restrict this drive, so what theoretical reason wants, what it strives for, what it strives to know, with what it can know, meaning that the Critique of Reason attempts to set reason's ends, so reason's questions, in relation to its own proper powers, so its own faculties. And it does this in two parts. So the Critique of Pure Reason has two books. The first book is called The Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, which engages in this quasi-archaeological work of like analyzing the depth of the faculties and of the forces and legislates their competences. So it tries, I sometimes think of it that way, it tries to assemble the legitimate elements and materials with which reason can legitimately build its house. How many bricks does it have? How big are they? What does the mortar consist of? What are, all of that kind of stuff. And the second doctrine of method follows, which is very short in comparison to the very long doctrine of elements. The second doctrine of method follows and asks, once we know what our legitimate elements are, what reason can do with them? What kind of house of reason can we build? And this is this methodological question, which seems to be nearly like an afterthought in the Critique of Pure Reason. And I would like to read the first paragraph from the Doctrine of Method in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is at A707, in case you want to look it up. Kant writes, "If I regard the sum total of all cognition of pure and speculative reason as an edifice," so in German the word for that is Gebäude, as a house, "for which we have in ourselves at least the idea, then I can say that in the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements," so that's the first book of the Critique of Pure Reason, "we have made an estimate of the building materials and determined for what sort of edifice, with what height and strength they would suffice. It turned out, of course, that although we had in mind a tower that would reach the heavens, the supply of materials sufficed only for a dwelling." In German, he uses the word Wohnhaus, or living house. "That was just roomy enough for our business on the place of experience and high enough to survey it. However, the bold undertaking had to fail from lack of material, not to mention the confusion of languages that unavoidably divided the workers over the plan and dispersed them throughout the world, leaving each to build on his own according to his own design. Now we are concerned not so much with the materials as with the plan." So he speaks now about the second book. "And having been warned not to venture some arbitrary and blind project that might entirely exceed our entire capacity, yet not being able to abstain from the erection of a sturdy dwelling, we have to aim at an edifice in relation to the supplies given to us, that is, at the same time, suited to our needs." So we can see from here that Kant's answer to the question of what kind of house reason is allowed to build is rather humbling. It is definitely not a tower of reason. Reason might have this drive towards ever further expansion and expression, objectivation, Äußerung. It tries to objectify itself in these kind of like products that it does. It tries to build and walk through this palace or like walk up the stairs to a tower that might reach to the heavens. But if we look at its fundaments and its real legitimate building materials, in the end, we might just be able to build a shack or perhaps a small house with 4 rooms that might just be arranged like the table of categories, right? That's sort of like where we arrive at. And that is sort of like this very strong Kantian critique to the memory practices that he inherited and that he sort of like came up through scholastic doctrinal philosophy, with its focus on memory and the system of philosophy or the tower of science. And so Kant put forth this image of Enlightenment reason and the practice of philosophizing over and against the system of philosophy as aligned with, firstly, self-critique, Secondly, taking stock of our legitimate elements and blocks. So this is the majority of the critique of pure reason. Thirdly, distraction, if we may say so. And 4, forgetting. And as always, I am quite late. So I don't know now maybe I was going to go into the 4th point of forgetting now, but given the fact that we only have a few minutes left, I might just incorporate this into next week's seminar and open who can speak after I've spoken so much, because also for sure there you might want to contribute many things, but also I would love if maybe each of you could introduce yourselves to Austin and me, and maybe say a little bit about your background in philosophy and your interests, or what it is you're thinking about right now. Yes. I'm afraid I have to finish this next seminar. Yeah, it is only delayed, not forgotten.
There's enough to think about already. It's great.
Yeah.
Sorry, only for my clarity, are you saying that you want to continue the introductions in the second seminar, in the second session?
Well, I have kind of like one major point, which would go now really more in detail in the anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, and the thought of forgetting. And I think I don't have time to do that because we're nearly at the end of our session. And so I think I'm gonna move that last very important point to the next seminar. And include it in my seminar in Stiegler, because it's also possible to do that. It might actually be quite interesting. And maybe finish here for today. So with this kind of more general reading of the critical philosophy and its really thorough critique of what a house of reason in which we live, think, remember, and invent looks like, as a larger Enlightenment project, which aligns itself with an idea. Of course, I haven't really laid that out now, but of forgetting rather than memories, such as my argument. While at the same time, you know, I've spent like a large portion of the seminar, of course, laying out to you the really fundamental problems that his forgetfulness, supposed forgetfulness, because in the end we might never find out, you know, the truth about it, but it's a problem for us. Much has been written about it, and so we have to deal with it and reflect on philosophy's own presuppositions, also on who gets to reason and what it means to have a healthy reason, and how philosophy can deal with pathological reasons, which is, you know, one of the other interesting questions, of course, that these cases like Kant, but also Nietzsche or Artaud, I mean, there are many figures like that in the history of philosophy by now, posed to us. Yeah, sorry, maybe, yeah, are there any questions or contributions for now?
Do we have time for that? That would be great. Can we extend a little bit past, or would that be unfair to people who have to leave?
Yeah, mostly. I do not have a problem with that personally, but I think people have designated commitments, so they might have to leave.
Okay,
maybe at least
then
one question?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if anyone wants to take the stage.
Well, I would have another quick one, just to do with this last point that you were talking about in the House of Reason, and this kind of, I mean, it seemed to me quite similar in a way, but also different in a sense from Hegel's idea of the sense in which like there's this kind of like dialectic and between life and consciousness in a sense. And I guess I'm not super familiar with Kant's third, like with the critique of practical reason, but I kind of I do know at least that there is kind of a development of Hegel's thought in terms of his idea of like yeah, this dialectic between life and consciousness, and in the sense that like the idea of the Gattungswesen is kind of like a check on the unlimited expansion of reason in a similar way. And I was wondering like whether Kant maybe like further develops this idea into something like whether it's that reason for Kant always is a check on itself, or if that starts to become supplemented later on by something else as well. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good question, but I guess it just came up for me.
It's like a very big question. I don't know also if Austin wants to chime in, but I think kind of like in the very broad outlines, you know, what we can say, it's of course very interesting because he starts out, right? He calls the first critique of pure reason, not even a critique, the critique, it's the only one. And then even though he did not plan to, he starts writing a second critique after the groundwork of the metaphysics of moral, which, as you say, is about pure practical reason. And then we have the third critique, but the third critique is no longer a critique of reason, it's a critique of judgment. And one of the interesting things about the Opus Posthumum is that, you know, Kant like kind of infinitely got stuck, we might say, in the propedeutic to his system of transcendental philosophy, engaged in the critical business, never really arriving at actually building the House of Reason. But at least the outline of this undertaking in changing form you can find in the Opus Posthumum, and there seemingly their judgment is very important, but he does now seem to propose that maybe this is a third critique of reason, but it's not of pure theoretical reason, it's not of pure practical reason, it's what, for example, what I read, and you can find this in outline, it's of technical practical reason. So I would say there's a movement throughout the Kantian oeuvre that you can trace, and there are many different readings of that. And of course, if you take a kind of smaller slice of his work, then, you know, yes, you might be left only with reasoned self-critique, you know, on that level. But the truth is that we do move on to a third critique, which is judgment, which seems to somehow, which has moved on from the problem of reason as in the way he has formulated it before, and by all means paints a much more dynamical picture and tries to renegotiate the relation between, well, we could say like thought and the world in this very inventive and what I consider to be very rich and beautiful way. I don't know, Austin, if you want to add something to that from the Hegelian point of view.
Well, actually, I would be more interested in hearing multiple comments from those who are here today. Maybe short comments, and like, it doesn't have to be a question, could be comments too, and maybe we'll respond next time or eventually.
I can go. I don't have a set sort of comment or question exactly, just a lot of thoughts floating around. I thought that was really compelling, Franziska, thank you. One thing that kind of came to mind, I'll keep it brief because I know kind of over time, it's sort of about the relationship between getting Can you still hear me? Everyone's frozen on my screen.
Now you're back, but you were gone for a
Yeah,
second.
you can. Sorry, my connection's unstable. Yeah, I think forgetting, remembering, and like things. So things like the 9/11 memorial, the Auschwitz Museum, these kind of ways in which remembering is kind of sewn into like the fabric of politics and stuff like that. And what that means, I guess, for that kind of relationship it has to forgetting, remembering. It's not really a fully formed quota question, but it's something that came to mind.
Yeah, Marcel, do you want to respond to that or add to that? Or
Yeah, I actually, yeah, I was actually a similar direction that I had a thought about earlier when we started the introduction. Yeah, because one of my interests in the past was sort of this idea of colonial amnesia, and I was thinking about that being one of the kind of, let's say, conditions of possibility of the Holocaust, and from the Holocaust, like flowing out or coming out of the Holocaust, a kind of contradictory injunction to remember. And one, like, what I find interesting there is that what happens once remembering or remembrance becomes this imperative, but still has this amnesia in it, in a way, to the extent to what we see now with Germany and its way, like how it's acting and its foreign politics, etc. And so that just kind of, I found that interesting in the way you picked that up. You didn't link it necessarily, but I made this link in my mind that there's always this, I think it was Alida Asman who referred to this mixture, that there's always this mixture between forgetting and remembering, and yeah, and I just find it interesting how that plays itself out in the social and in the political realm, and yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think you have really kind of like put your finger on the German predicament that is much discussed, and I'm hoping I've kind of like changed in the next seminar a little bit, apart from the fact that I also have to talk about Kant's forgetting, but I'm hoping to speak quite extensively about this Lyotard book called Heidegger and the Jews. I don't know, I think you might be interested in it, Marcel, because one of them, it kind of like suggests that the way that what he calls the Jews have been forgotten by Occidental thought is, he likens it to the kind of primary repression in Freud, which thus also cannot be remembered in the same way that anything else can be remembered. And so one could extend this argument to then say, of course, that if the Holocaust has become, has entered the theater of remembrance in the way that, and treated in that certain way, it's in a way a complete misunderstanding of the level on which this what you called like forgetting, or this repression, has taken place for so many centuries, and which eventually expressed itself in this most violent and terrible genocidal project. So I'm hoping to spend some more time on that more explicitly in the next seminar. Sorry, I spoke again. There are some more questions, I think, or comments.
I'm writing down anything that you chat, and I think we'll all be reading it. it's great if you
Yeah.
chat to everyone, because these are some really interesting things I'm seeing in the chat as well.
And the other thing, which I think has really worked very well in the past also, is that if there are any kind of like questions that, you know, sometimes also we don't feel comfortable speaking on Zoom. I know I often feel like that, or maybe also just things that come up later, is like always really like very generous to write these questions down and send them. And I really love getting them, and often they really help me also write the next seminar. So, and I think they can be good for like all of us, you know, to kind of prepare together.
Yeah. So, do you think people should mail them to you?
Yes.
Okay.
Could we make some kind of a forum or bulletin board for this as well? That would be
We have
interesting.
one on Discord. We have one on Discord. We have Google Classroom otherwise.
Great.
So those two platforms are sort of more fluid in that sense. Emails are more strict in disciplining some stuff. I mean, they have those connotations. But yeah.
Discord seems like a great place, because then conversations can also happen between you all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a Discord group already for the seminar in the larger Discord of the new center. So are you sort of part of it, or should I ask?
We'll talk
I'm
about
sort of
that. I'm not on it yet. I look
okay,
forward to it.
okay. Sure.
I'm on
So then
Discord.
Rafael will sort of take care of that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
Maybe someone, if anyone still just like maybe wants to say their name and where they come from, or like kind of where they're coming from in terms of like their background, or if they have like kind of a guiding question related to the seminar or also unrelated. Maybe that's something we can still take a few minutes for. And then in the very end, I'll say some more practical things.
Hi. Hello? Can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Sorry, I have to leave. I just thought I'd go ahead. I'm Rob. I'm currently based in London, and this is my first time taking a seminar with the New Centre. I did my BA at Goldsmiths in Cultural Studies, and I did an MFA in Fine Art Practice at Goldsmiths in 2022. I currently work as an art technician, and I took your course because it's something that is completely alien to me, and I wanted to read something new and different. And today was really, really interesting. So thank you very much for covering a lot of ground. I really appreciate that.
Of course.
Okay, I'm going to sign off now. All right, thank you.
Bye, Rob. See you
Bye.
next week.
See you next week.
Reverse alphabetical order? By first names? Or how do you want to do it?
I can go. Hi, Franziska. I'm
Hello.
Meg. I'm also a musician. I'm in a punk band. And I studied philosophy and theology in the past. One thing that I also a big fan of Yeats. One thing that I found compelling about Yeats' memory book was that the like mnemotechnics reveal these like imaginal parades which are forgotten. So like, and especially like the parades are like violent images. So like the dark and heretical side of like the remembering of the lost, forgotten art of memory has these like sort of yeah, these like this strange like dream imagery. So the idea of the Lethe techniques is really compelling to me, and I'm wondering like if there's like this heretical like dark side of the mnemotechnics, I guess, like what would the heresy of the Lethe techniques be?
Does anyone else want to go next?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ivan. I am originally from Russia, but now I've left the country and now I live in Georgia. And I am a new media artist and a writer, so I'm kind of working as a freelance writer, writing on technology and some kind of artsy theory or maybe some philosophy also. Um, and I've enrolled to this seminar because I've recently written an essay about actually nostalgia in digital world. And it really fascinated me how those digital infrastructures structure not only the memorizing process, but also the forgetting process, or how they produce the impossibility to forget something, and how at the same time they sort of commodify nostalgia and undermine it. So I decided that this seminar is the right place to be for me. Yeah, by the way, thank you for the very interesting introduction. Can wait for the next session.
Thank you.
I can go. My name's Olivia. I'm based in Paris, but I'm from the United States. I've been in France for 4 years. And I have a little bit of a background in continental philosophy, but there's so much I still don't know, and a background in art and curatorial practice and writing. So just excited to sort of use my brain again after just working a full-time job and not really doing much critical thought. So yeah, excited to be here.
I can go next. Yeah, I have a background in philosophy and performance. And I currently work at a design studio in Berlin. And I don't know, like it just connects very well because it's often very like research based, at least in the beginning. And at the same time, I don't know, like I mentioned before, I have like some interest. I'm German, so I have some interest in, yeah, in the sort of like contradictions of memory politics and the sort of forgetting of forgetting in a way, as a crucial element to social life. But I'm also very interested in, for instance, the connection between psychoanalysis and Hegel's philosophy, and sort of this movement of Lacan, of like socializing Freud and trying to understand these like very clinical and seemingly personal insights, and applying them and thinking them through the social. So yeah, I don't know, it was already a great session, and I'm looking forward to next ones.
Maybe I can go next. My name is Isaac. I am from Colombia, currently based in Bogota. I have a background in sociology and philosophy. I was interested in the seminar because I have been working in the problem of memory and forgetfulness in literature, especially in Latin American literature, and also like a more general, maybe practical or political interest, because here in Colombia we have a war that is we are like trying to overcome the war, but also there are a lot of politics of memory about the war, and it's this paradoxical thing of making memory of a war that is still happening or is still active. So I was interested in how to think about the forgetfulness and the relation with memory in this like particular political context here in Colombia. So yeah, this is like thank you for the seminar. It has been very interesting for me, like this first session.
Would it be okay if I call people out? Yeah, will that be fine?
It looks like
course.
someone just showed their face who wasn't showing before. Maybe Nick really wants to just introduce himself. I don't know why else he showed his face.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I wasn't waiting to be invited. I just thought maybe someone would go before me. Yeah, thanks, Franziska. That was really brilliant and also very challenging in a good way. So yeah, I'm really excited for how this unfolds. Yeah, I'm Nick, and well, I have a background in design and kind of web programming, software stuff. But I would describe myself now as a writer, and I have an MA in critical studies, which is basically a writing program. But I have quite an interest in philosophy and critical theory. And like very broadly speaking, I guess my interests are in kind of like technology and subjectivity. But in most of my like personal kind of research, when I've had the time to delve into these things, it's mostly been through kind of like critical theory, Frankfurt School type stuff. So a bit of like Freud and Marxism, tiny bit of Hegel, and then kind of like later a little beyond the school, Zizek, Psychoanalysis, Lacan, this kind of stuff. But I've kind of recently kind of, I guess maybe like diversified my interests, and like Stiegler has become quite interesting to me, along with a few other thinkers. And like, just the description of the seminar really spoke to that. So, that's why I'm here. In terms of like specifically kind of the concepts we're dealing with, I'm trying to, it's very slow, but I'm trying to work on a project or a text or some long-term project on conspiracy and totality. And I guess I feel not stuck, but I'm interested in like kind of bringing in the questions of time and memory to that, because I guess I've been thinking quite like spatial terms about it, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting seminar, and yeah, I'm sure I will benefit from it. Thanks. I'm also wondering, sorry, very quickly, Franziska, because I know that this will be recorded, so we could always like watch it back. But if you have, I don't know, a text that frames what you've been doing today, or somewhere you can point us on like this, like somewhere you've written about this already that we could read.
It's not out yet, but there will be a text. Yeah.
Okay. I'll watch the video instead, because it's good to go over again. Thanks.
But there's many sources, that I really also just presented a lot of sources too. Like there's Leida Assmann, there's Harald Weinrich, Francis Yates, and Carson, Schiepelmann when it comes to Kant, if you're a reader of German. But yeah, I guess the Kant thing is maybe the thing that has least secondary literature, at least compiled in that way, and that I have written about that, and it should come out later this year. So yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll follow that. Thanks.
Would it be all right if we just hear from Libby before we go on to anything else or stop?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I had to become mobile. My name is Libby. I'm originally from Honolulu, Hawaii, and most recently I was based in California, but right now I'm a bit between things and places. My background is in fine arts. I'm a painter, and also in the history and philosophy of medicine and the body. That became a more broad interest in the history and philosophy of technology. And I'm also part of the certificate program at the New Center in Art and Curatorial Practice. My reasons specifically for being interested in the seminar, I have recently become involved as a more of a caregiver for someone with dementia. And I'm just really, I don't know, given my background in also thinking about illness and health philosophically, I feel really interested in making sense of dementia and this highly personal but also widespread condition in a philosophical sense. I think I've been sort of hungry for that, but haven't really come across it anywhere. And I'm really interested in the way that that is that experience is involved in these broader conversations about migration and forgetting and sort of historical context in which people become sick or not sick. So, but yeah, my personal practice is in a bit of an in-between space. I will hopefully be starting an MFA program in fine arts this fall. So I'm just trying to keep painting and writing, and yeah, really appreciate the New Center as a source of like sustained intellectual stimulation. So I'm excited to think and work with this seminar.
To the few remaining people that are still here, because so many people have had to go, like, I think Austin and me, maybe we would do best to send an email about kind of like the practical requirements of taking this course for credit. So I'm not going to mention that now, but maybe the ones of you who are still here, so in case you're planning to take this course for credit, you have to do in-class presentation, and also we will be very lucky to receive your in-class presentation. And so maybe the ones who are here, maybe if you if you would be willing, or at least some of you, in case you want to take for credit, to present in the next seminar, that would be great. And then Austin and me are gonna write a more structured email to the rest of us about presenting in seminar 3 and 4. But I fear if no one presents in the next seminar, then Austin's time will be severely limited. And so, yeah, you would be doing us a great favor if some of you would volunteer to present already in the next seminar. And these presentations are, of course, supposed to be on our topic, if possible, on the texts that we are discussing in the class, but they can be very small, or in fact I think they should be rather small, and you can also do them in groups. And I always recommend to do something very simple, something like talking 5 minutes about something you understood, or something you don't understand, or something you find really irritating, or like really try to be very specific about one thing that you want to contribute to the conversation. You don't have to really introduce the text or do a lot of like laying out, because that's in a way my job. And I think it's much better if we hear like your comments or like your problems with things, So yeah. Marcel.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm interested, and also if anyone wants to join, just because I just finished the philosophy of thermodynamics, and there I worked on the presentation for the Stiegler text that we were discussing, and I'm writing on it too. So it's kind of like I'm already in his writing in a way.
Great.
Felt like it would be a nice way to kind of continue that.
That's great. Yeah, that sounds excellent. And yeah, I know Joel, and in fact, I taught a Stiegler course last term, and he gave one of the seminars. And we also, well, he went to the CRMEP like Austin and myself. We're old friends. And that's great. So yeah, if anyone wants to join Marcel and you know, maybe offer us like a certain problematization or like a certain question, can be anything from a methodological problem to you know, a challenge by another author on a very specific point, etc. Just something that you think will enrich the kind of bouquet of what the rest of the class will provide.
Sorry,
You don't have
just some. Oh, sorry. No, the presentation will be on the text we're reading for next week. So the Stiegler text, right? Okay, yeah. In that case, I'm up for joining you, Marcel. So you can count me in too.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well then I leave you two up to make a plan. And I think maybe it's time to wrap it up now. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. It's a real honor for me to present some of these things and share them. Normally, you know, it's a rather solitary undertaking. So yeah, thanks for listening and for being interested, and maybe one last very brief thing to say is that I guess in the best case, you know, philosophical inquiry is driven by a myriad of motivations, of which, at least in my case, the strongest often seems to be kind of a problem that also interferes with my personal life. It's just you know, often the things we're interested in theoretically are driven by things we just don't understand. And so I'm very sympathetic for certain things that I've heard, you know, from the group of people here on how they have come to think about questions related to memory and forgetting. And I guess also this is what Austin and me have tried to contextualize a little bit in the beginning, on a certain urgency that at least myself feel right now to work through these questions in the present political context with renewed urgency and maybe force also. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Austin.
Thank you.
Immediately.